Now I'm going to ask our panelists to interact, create some synergy here, to use a buzzword. First, I'd just like to mention a few of the themes that I picked up on here. Theme of the discovery in the archives, discovery in the world around us. The relationship between the story that is in the sources and the story that is imposed on the sources to try to make some sense of them. The issue, another theme, what the relationship between what was and what is and what could have been. That kind of unrealized part of things. The question of why we write what we write about. I'm reminded of David McCullough when he talked about why he wrote the Johnstown Flood. He said there was no book that he found worth reading on the topic, so he decided to write a book that he would like to read. The question of visual versus literate. And yes, we need to use visual, but what do you do when you don't have the visual? Well, as Nancy says, you try to create a visual portrait through words. The issue of big picture versus specific, and the particular, placing the particular within a context. The use of history as a method of inquiry. So history isn't just a narrative reconstruction of the past, it's also a means for getting at things. The technological revolution, old technology like film versus new technology like digital images, and many of us who have VHS now have to convert them to DVDs, and because when the VCRs in the classroom are broken, they're not going to fix them anymore. And then the question of history versus historiography, and I'm always reminded of what Eugene Borza, one of my teachers at Penn State, he was a professor of ancient history, said, there is no history, there's only historiography. So I'll turn it over to the panelists if they have other themes that they'd like to mention, or simply Sean.
This is not a question so much as a observation or comment, and it arises out of listening to Megan and John. In both of their presentations, I found a very strong theme of serendipity, finding a couple of lost love letters tucked beneath the pages of a tome, or finding a Colorado Railroad project map somewhere in Kentucky. These are accidents of research, and they're prized moments for anybody in our business. But my observation is that they cannot be foreseen, they cannot be planned for, and in particular, they cannot be incorporated into grant proposals. So there is a tension between this particular delight that we've all experienced and the practical problem of getting one's work done. I'm not aware of any solution to it. If one wrote in a grant proposal that I proposed to drive across Kentucky and stuff my Suburban with scraps of paper, well, you can imagine how successful that grant proposal would be. I have no solution, it's just an observation.
I'd like to respond to that. I have taught here 35 years and I have never, ever had a grant. Live cheaply, eat peanut butter on the road, and just drive, because nobody is going to give you money to go do something. You're exactly right. Just to suggest what the kind of work I think ought to be done more, you're right. A young person not going to get a grant to do it.
I had the experience in the book, the Peabody Sisters, of there were a couple of mysteries that were quite well known. One about had Nathaniel Hawthorne been engaged to the older sister Elizabeth before he then jilted her and switched his affections to Sophia. And this is a mystery that had been outstanding for, well, since the time of the marriage in 1842. And I spent a very long time on this book, and 20 years, and I hadn't gotten the answer at least 10 years into it, and I didn't necessarily think I would. A Mass Historical Society manuscript discovery did help me on this, and I was able to publish something new on the subject, but as a result, now my editor expects me always to find answers to things. So I'm working now on a biography of Elizabeth Hawthorne, E.B. Hawthorne, the older sister of Nathaniel, who was a fascinating recluse, and maybe, well, anyway, I find her life exciting. But one thing that is known about her is that she published once a poem, and this poem was published before Nathaniel Hawthorne published anything. She was a teenager. And my editor says, well, you're going to find it, aren't you? And I can't promise that, and I don't know. Anyway, I feel mildly in a bind, but I guess my sense is a little bit like what John says. You're open to things. I may not find that poem, but I'm probably going to find something that's going to get me excited. And that's kind of what I was trying to say by reading these things. It's the excitement that you feel with the contact with the material that then feeds your writing. And I feel that without that, it's not, I'm writing also, at the same time, working on Margaret Fuller, and I thought, oh, this is going to be great because all her correspondence is already in print, and that some wonderful scholar has edited it, and all the references to everyone is clear, and and I'm reading this stuff in 6 volumes of normal printed stuff, not Margaret Fuller's own handwriting, and I'm finding it very hard. And so I go to the archives and find the odd thing that maybe it's not a letter, it's a journal or a little essay that she wrote when she was a kid. Those are the things that get me excited and that are building the energy that's going to, I hope, make the book an interesting new one.
And I add a thought on serendipity as a tool that we could use. That is, people read serendipitously, and one could think about how we could write the books that lend themselves to serendipity. And one would be a book that would have, let's say, lots of substantive footnotes that would go off on various tangents one way or another. The model would be Bayle's Dictionary. I don't know if you've seen Bayle's Dictionary, published 400 years ago, and it has footnotes, top notes, side notes, and a little scrap of text in the middle of the page.
Hypertext.
And I think that's a wonderful opportunity for a serendipitous reader. And appendices help a lot as well. The problem is publishers don't like to publish books of that sort.
Well, there's a book that's kind of a favored book of biographers called Out of Sheer Rage by Jeff Dyer. I don't know if any of you know this book, but it's all about Jeff Dyer trying to write about D.H. Lawrence and never quite getting this book done. And it's I love reading it. Particularly when I thought I would never get my book done, I thought, well, at least maybe I could just write about not getting it done. But he does convey a lot about D.H. Lawrence by way of, he goes to find where he lived and this and that. It's just wonderful, again, maybe about the anti-serendipity of that particular quest.
I wanted to ask you, the two Johns in particular, about something that David just mentioned too, which is that publishers don't want X. And I'm thinking how we're right on the verge now of people interested in material history and environmental history, and the visual is exploding all around us. But writing brings us down to, pieces of paper and illustrations on them, and I'm wondering whether you see a challenge in the future of getting publishers to publish the kind of books you want in terms of the number of images and the kinds of charts. I mean, it's very expensive to do that. And whether the particular, I would think in environmental history, and then there's like 3D that you can do, 3D images that you can do with global positioning and stuff like that, and whether you can get that into print, and whether we've got a little bit of a clash between our interest in materiality and studying the real physical world around us and getting that into written form, both in our prose and then in how you package the book. Yeah.
As you probably anticipate, the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
one of my night jobs is to co-edit a environmental history series for Cambridge University Press. And I'm always losing battles in which I am allied with an author or a prospective author who wants to have lots of images, lots of maps, and they're really necessary for the fully rounded telling of the tale. And the representatives of the press say 8 but no more. And it's all, as you realize, cost driven. And then books don't get published over this because the author won't accept only 8, or if for other cost-related reasons, books that might be wonderful but aren't going to sell. Even university presses now will pass on. It's,
what about the option I've heard of some people putting things up on the web as appendixes and supplements to their printed books? Do you think there's a possibility there?
Yeah, people do that and should do that.
Yeah.
It's second best, I think.
It's a bibliographical nightmare.
But
for the librarians.
yes, for those who want to cite the website.
Well, and for librarians to keep track of it and for it to last forever and for it to be archived.
The link is broken.
I do think it's gotten a little less expensive to do at least, some illustrating. I mean, when I started off on my Peabody Sisters book, they said, well, only 10 illustrations, but by the time I was able to, I published it many years later, there are 50 illustrations in there, and it was, to me, an extraordinary experience to sort of, what I had written turned into almost a sketchbook or a scrapbook, which also reminds me, I have a friend, a novelist. This is a work of fiction she's doing, but it's a fiction that will read like a scrapbook. And some mainstream publishers very happy to do this mainly illustrated book that will sort of, I guess, a kind of a graphic novel. So I think maybe, again, it's a question of what you're conveying and what the story is, as well as the number of illustrations required. You were going to say something?
Well, yes, I don't like reading a lot of stuff on the web. Maybe if I were 40 years younger, but it bothers my eyes after a while. But sometimes it's necessary to make people see reason. And maybe the publishers are going to have to see reason. It's fine for me to talk about my 35mm slides, but you can always move the argument. I told an administrator here that I have a Rolleiflex too, and I make a lot of 2 1/4 images that I don't show. He was very nice. He immediately assigned me their antiques, but the great big lucent projectors that are longer than this table. There's no projectionist and whatever, and most classrooms are too small. But once a student sees a 2 1/4 slide projected, the 35mm slide looks pretty grim, and the digital image is just gone. So if you plant the seed of, let's start printing our own books, okay? Because I mean, I think there's something to that. I mean, we assume there have to be publishers. Well, we don't get red caps at the train station anymore. We don't get lots of things anymore. And it dawned on me about a year ago when my publisher, I have a book in press now, said, well, you have a lot of illustrations here. And I said, well, you choose the ones to get rid of. And the new idea is, could you cut the book into 3 short books instead of 1 very long book?
Well,
This is a respected university press in a southern state, which I thought had been reconstructed correctly. Well, you all laugh, but this is no joke. What you're raising is a very serious problem. And I'm beginning to think, one more thing, please. I'm beginning to think that kids are starting to turn away from doing everything on the screen. Supposedly teenagers have lost interest in reading blogs. It could be we've already passed the crest, right? Mind you, I didn't see the crash coming myself, so.
I think it's getting easier to use visual materials, even to use color materials. The Donnelly Corporation, which is that huge, I think the largest press in the world, publishes every year a specimen of its printing art, which is a series called Lakeside Classics. And the recent volumes have been illustrated in color on cheap paper, on plain paper. And they're developing the resolution and lowering the cost. And I would think that's very hopeful. As to the trend, I find that with every passing year, my students get visually more intelligent. And they can process an image in a microsecond and do things with it that elude their elders who grew up before television.
I was going to say, maybe, I wonder if any of us can, stepping aside from books, what is the new technology doing for history in ways that, that books cannot do? And I have one example to mention, a website called Diarna, D-I-A-R-N-A, which has to do with Jewish homelands in the Middle East. And this is a huge collaborative effort which uses Google Earth and imposes on it, I guess you go to these certain sites, people who actually live there now are contributing photographs and documents and interviews with people. You can kind of, old photographs from their family archives, so that where there were synagogues, where there are no longer synagogues, maybe you can see a photo of this, and it's very hard for me to describe because I'm not someone who does a lot of this, but I think there are ways that maybe this audience that David's talking about can participate in history on the web, and it can be a global project of historians and then people on the ground who just want to preserve their past. I don't know if anyone else has something they can recommend like that.
Well, I do. I want to say something else about this. Whatever we do, the general public, I think David is right. I think the general public in many ways is ahead of us. And I don't know about using websites, but I think the general public now wants to know things because it has learned about all kinds of things on the web that previously the editorial process in publishing kind of controlled. If there weren't books on the subject or an article, it was hard to learn about. Now there can be a real wingnut on the web talking about something totally wrong, but at least they begin to think, well, there's something to this, right? And sometimes you get into bad trouble. I do it easily. But an example of this is I've always kind of remembered a historical event if it happened on my birthday. And by accident, in reading just before the web moment, a really cheaply printed, not published, memoir of a tugboat captain in Seattle, he talked about the summer of 1941 watching one steamship hit another one, and all these sailors poured out of the steamship that had been hit. And it dawned on me that sailors are Navy personnel. Seamen work aboard steamships. But it happened on my birthday. And about 5 years later, by pure luck, by reading for pleasure, on the same day, the same steamship was noticed in a harbor in East Africa. And I had to go back and find this thing a friend of mine had loaned me and thought, gee, this must have been the wrong year. But when I was in Washington looking in an archive, I requested the log of that steamship. And I wrote under notes possibly 2 items. And I had an expensive sandwich and came back, and there were 2 men with short hair in nice suits who asked me why I wanted it. And I asked them who they were, and it was the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the log is still classified. And I said, and they gave me a form to fill out to declassify it. I'm still waiting years later. But now the reason I'm telling you this is the steamship Rona, Her Majesty's Transport Rona, its existence was denied until 1999 by the British and American governments. But it was sunk by a smart bomb launched from a German aircraft. The denial operation continued until survivors got together on the web through a website in New Orleans and pushed our government to acknowledge this ship was sunk. and the survivors were marooned in North Africa to keep them from demoralizing other American troops. The web is doing something, I promise you. I think publishers are either afraid of that something or are unwilling to even notice it. Granted, what you're talking about cannot be done in a book, but on the other hand, a book could respond to what's being done on the web. And I think publishers have to decide to put up or shut up really soon. Or a lot of us are going to be in the game. Publish the book on demand. That would do it. Okay.
The web can do wonderful things. I'm working now on a book about Africa, and a lot of it's about the slave trade. And I'm sure many here in this room know that now, instead of the old Donin volumes that we had on the slave trade, we now have a database with the details of 34,000 slave ships. And they are in meticulous detail, and only the web could do such a thing as that, and they are completely accessible. No limits of any kind. But then on the other side, as to books, a good many people send me email messages to say how much they love a beautiful book. Right. And I think it's no more costly to publish a beautiful book than a repellent, ugly book. And I think one of the best ways forward here is to publish beautiful books. And I think that's
I have another question. I'm feeling kind of naughty here, but we're all we've all published at least 2 books. We're advanced in our careers. How are we teaching PhDs to write the way David and all of us have been talking about, how we want to write for the general reader, we want to make history relevant, and yet we're still marching our students necessarily through the PhD process where they write something that's terribly encumbered with footnotes and highly historiographical, and I don't know that in most graduate programs there's any effort to also teach the sort of registers of prose that we're talking about. I mean, that is, I think we need the register of prose where you're talking to your specialists with a lot of density, but we also should be able to write more broadly. And there's a great historian in my department, David Kennedy, who has been telling us for years, we need to be writing for the public, you people, and generally he writes pretty accessibly, but most of us don't. So do we have a problem at the very bottom line, training our graduate students and never giving them an opportunity to write in a kind of soaring, consistent narrative voice? Anybody?
There's some good teaching that way at Oxford, the tutorial system.
Oh, in England.
Where where students are asked every week to bring in 4 sides, as they call it. And then I think what really makes the difference is that then they were asked to read it aloud. And in an Oxford college, you'll hear a low drone in the afternoon as everybody's reading aloud. But what they do is get the music of the language in the ear. Yeah. They get the cadence of the language. Yeah. And Oxford students learn to write. It's taught to them.
And think of the great British historians that write really accessible prose. I'm thinking of Simon Schama.
Yeah. I sort of work back the opposite way, which is I'm teaching in a writing program and trying to get creative writers interested in history. And I'm finding I have a great success taking them into the archives and getting excited about what they can find there, and then getting them to be honest and learn the work of a historian is what comes for them after going at the writing of it. So it's an interesting puzzle, but anyway, I think it'd be nice if the two could merge.
Yeah.
Samuel Eliot Morison wrote a history of naval operations in World War II in 14 volumes, and he read all of it aloud to his wife. It reads very well.
And she didn't murder him.
Yeah, no.
Well, one of the problems with that has been talked about in various publications, like a Chronicle of Higher Education, is that in order to get jobs, graduate students have to fit a kind of narrow clone-like path. And I'm reminded a few years ago, one of our enterprising young scholars in early Russian history had proposed, well, why don't we just referee among ourselves books and put them up on the web? And the response was, well, that won't get us tenure. It won't get the young people tenure. They have to do things a certain way. And even to the point where they can't be seen to be being proponents of strange ideas, things that don't quite fit in. So how do we deal with that?
Not everybody who gets a PhD gets a job in a university. It's worth figuring out where they go to work and what history means to them. They might not ever write it, or what they write might be a report to a CEO somewhere. But I know quite a few people who are very good historians, but they are employed by corporations with a disposition to act. And I've never done any consulting for money either, because when I was a graduate student here, some old-timers told me, you get a lot more over your life if you don't take any money and they owe you a favor. But what they're working on is often incredible, but it's not published, but it is written about. And I think we should beware the loss from the public realm into the corporate realm of, I mean, they go somewhere and they keep on thinking, but their thinking becomes private and directed.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that, and I invite everyone to come back in 100 years for the bicentennial of the Harvard Extension School. Thank you, really. Thank you for coming.